September 1998. A soundstage maintenance closet at Warner Brothers Studios, Burbank, California. A janitor named Hector Salgado is sitting on an overturned bucket during his lunch break, reading a letter for the third time. He is 51 years old. He has worked the night janitorial shift at Warner Brothers for 19 years. The letter in his hands is from UCLA, addressed to his daughter Maria. It is an acceptance letter. It is also, folded behind it, a financial aid summary that does not come close to covering what UCLA actually costs, once you account for housing, books, and the difference between what aid covers and what a family still has to find on its own. Hector does the math the way he has done the math his whole working life, slowly, with his finger moving down a column of numbers, hoping the total changes if he adds it again. It does not change. He folds the letter back into his shirt pocket. He finishes his sandwich. He goes back to work. 11 days later, a check is going to arrive at his house that he will spend years trying to understand. Here is the story. Hector Salgado came to the United States from Jalisco, Mexico in 1971, when he was 24 years old. He worked construction in East Los Angeles for 6 years before a foreman who liked his work ethic got him an interview for a maintenance position at Warner Brothers in 1977. He took the job because it was steady, because the studio offered benefits that construction work never had, and because his wife, Rosa, was pregnant with their first child, and steady had become, almost overnight, the single most important word in his vocabulary. He started on the night crew, cleaning sound stages and production offices after the day's filming had wrapped, and he stayed on the night crew for the rest of his career, not because he lacked the ability to move into something else, but because the night shift paid a small differential, and Hector had decided early on that every extra dollar a paycheck offered was a dollar his children's future could use. He and Rosa had 2 children, a son, Miguel, born in 1978, and a daughter, Maria, born in 1980. Hector worked the sound stages of Warner Brothers for 19 years by the time Maria's UCLA letter arrived in September of 1998, emptying trash cans and waxing floors and replacing burned-out lighting fixtures in production offices that, over the decades, had belonged to executives, directors, and occasionally to actors who kept odd hours and were still working when Hector's shift began at 11 at night. He was a quiet, careful man, well-liked by the crews who came and went through the sound stages, the kind of studio employee whose face becomes so familiar over 2 decades that people greet him by name without remembering exactly how they learned it. Maria Salgado had been the kind of student teachers wrote letters about without being asked. She had graduated from Burbank High School in June of 1998 with a grade point average that put her in the top 2% of her class, a record of community service that included 4 years of volunteer tutoring at an elementary school in her neighborhood, and a UCLA acceptance that her guidance counselor had described, in a note attached to the congratulations card the school sent home, as one of the most deserved admissions she had seen in 15 years of writing recommendation letters. Hector had cried reading that note, briefly, alone in the kitchen, before Rosa came in and he wiped his face quickly and told her it was nothing, just something in his eye. The financial reality, though, was simpler and harder than the pride. UCLA's financial aid package covered a meaningful portion of tuition based on the family's income, but it did not cover housing in the dormitories, and it did not cover books, and it did not cover the gap between what the aid formula assumed a family like the Salgados could contribute and what the Salgados actually had available after 19 years of a night janitor's wages and a part-time seamstress's income from Rosa, who took in alterations work from a dry cleaner in Burbank to help make ends meet. The gap, calculated across 4 years, came to just over $32,000. Hector had $11,000 in a savings account he had been building since Maria was born, money he had always intended for exactly this purpose and had never once touched for anything else. Not a car repair, not a medical bill, not a single vacation in 20 years of marriage. $11,000 against $32,000 left a gap that no amount of overtime on the night shift was going to close in the 4 years Maria needed it closed. Where are you watching from? Drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story reaches. Clint Eastwood had been making pictures at Warner Brothers for over 2 decades by 1998, a relationship that had begun with Dirty Harry in 1971 and had deepened into one of the longest and most stable director-studio relationships in modern Hollywood history. He shot most of his pictures on the Warner lot. He kept an office there. He had, over the years, developed the particular and genuine habit, uncommon among actors and directors of his stature, of knowing the names of the people who kept his sets running, not just the department heads and the line producers, but the grips, the craft services staff, the night maintenance crews who cleaned up after a production wrapped for the day and prepared the soundstage for the next morning's call. He had learned this habit the same place he had learned most of his habits about how to treat a set. From decades of watching which directors earned loyalty from crews and which directors merely demanded compliance. And from his own clear preference, dating back to his earliest years on television westerns, for being the kind of person crews wanted to work for, rather than the kind they merely tolerated. He knew Hector Salgado the way he knew a number of the long-time night maintenance staff, by name, by a few minutes of conversation here and there across years of overlapping schedules, when a late-night editing session or a script meeting kept Eastwood on the lot past the hour when the day crews had gone home and the night crews had come on. He did not know Hector well in any deep sense. He knew that Hector had been on the lot a long time, that he was quiet and thorough and took evident pride in work that most people in the industry walked past without seeing, and that he had 2 children he occasionally mentioned with the particular brevity of a man who does not consider it appropriate to burden a famous person with family talk, but cannot quite help mentioning it anyway, the way any proud father cannot quite help it. In late September of 1998, Eastwood was on the lot late, finishing notes on a script with his longtime assistant, when he passed Hector in a production office hallway, working his way down the corridor with a cart of cleaning supplies. They exchanged the usual brief greeting. Eastwood noticed, the way he noticed most things, that Hector seemed distracted, his usual careful attention to the baseboards and trim slightly absent that night. He asked, in the unhurried way he asked most things, whether everything was all right. Hector, who had not planned to mention anything to anyone, found himself, in the particular way exhausted parents sometimes do when someone finally asks the right question at the right moment, telling Eastwood about Maria's acceptance letter, about the $32,000 gap, about the $11,000 that would not stretch the rest of the way, no matter how many times he added the column. He told it briefly, almost apologetically, the way a private man tells a story he did not intend to tell. And he ended it by saying that they would find a way, that Maria was not going to lose this opportunity over money, even if it meant a second mortgage or years of payment plans that would follow them into Hector's old age. Eastwood listened. He asked a few questions, not many. The kind of questions a man asks when he is gathering exactly the information he needs and nothing more. He asked where Maria had been accepted, what she planned to study, whether the gap was calculated per year or across all 4 years combined. Hector answered each question. Eastwood nodded. He said it sounded like Hector had raised a remarkable daughter. He said goodnight. He walked back toward his office. Hector finished his shift and went home, and did not think much more about the conversation beyond a brief, warm surprise that a man as busy and as famous as Clint Eastwood had taken 5 minutes to ask a janitor about his daughter's college plans. Eastwood, in the days that followed, did exactly what he had done before in similar situations over the years, which was to route the matter through channels specifically designed to obscure his involvement. He contacted his business manager. He gave him the relevant facts, the name, the amount, the timeline across 4 years rather than a single lump payment, since a lump sum large enough to cover 4 years at once risked drawing the kind of attention and questions that would defeat the entire purpose. He specified that the arrangement needed to look like something Maria had qualified for on her own merits, not something gifted to her father as an employee, because Eastwood understood, with the same instinct that had guided every similar arrangement he had quietly built over the decades, that the dignity of the thing depended entirely on it never looking like charity directed at the parent. A scholarship fund was established within 2 weeks, administered through a small educational foundation that handled several genuine scholarship programs for the children of studio below-the-line workers across multiple productions. A foundation that existed for entirely legitimate reasons before Eastwood's contribution and continued administering other unrelated scholarships after it. Eastwood's contribution was directed specifically, through private instruction to the foundation's director, toward funding what was termed an Excellence in Service Family Scholarship, awarded, the documentation specified, based on a combination of the recipient's academic record and a parent's long tenure of exemplary service within the entertainment industry. A category broad enough on paper to plausibly include any number of families, and specific enough in practice to apply, that year, to exactly one. The foundation's director understood, without ever being told explicitly, whose money was actually funding the award. She had handled similarly structured anonymous gifts before. She did not ask questions. She processed the paperwork the way she processed any other scholarship, which meant Maria Salgado received, 11 days after Hector's hallway conversation, a letter from a foundation she had never heard of, informing her that she had been selected to receive a 4-year Excellence in Service Family Scholarship, covering the full gap between her financial aid package and the actual cost of her UCLA education, renewable each year, contingent only on maintaining good academic standing, which, for Maria Salgado, was never going to be in serious doubt. Have you ever watched a parent's face change the exact moment an impossible math problem suddenly becomes possible? It is one of the purest expressions of relief a human face can make, because it is relief mixed with disbelief, mixed with a kind of grief for all the nights of worry that turned out, in the end, not to have been necessary, though there was no way to have known that at the time. Hector Salgado read the foundation's letters standing in his kitchen, the same kitchen where he had cried briefly over the guidance counselor's note. He read it twice. He called Rosa in from the other room. They read it together a 3rd time. Hector called the foundation's listed number the following morning, both to confirm the letter was genuine and out of the simple human need to ask someone, anyone, how this had happened, why his daughter specifically had been selected for an award structured around criteria that sounded, the more he read them, suspiciously tailored to his own life. The foundation's director told him, in the careful and rehearsed language such conversations require, that the scholarship committee had reviewed a number of qualifying families across several studio productions, and that Maria's combination of academic merit and her father's 19 years of exemplary service had made her selection straightforward. She told him the donor, or donors behind the foundation's general fund, preferred to remain unacknowledged, as was standard practice for most of the foundation's scholarship programs, and that this was simply a condition of the award rather than anything specific to his daughter's case. Hector accepted this explanation, the way a man accepts an explanation he badly wants to believe and has no particular evidence to doubt. He thanked her. He hung up the phone. He went back to work that night with a lightness in his step that the day crew, coming on as he was leaving, noticed and asked him about, and he told them, simply, that his daughter had gotten some good news about school. Maria Salgado attended UCLA from the fall of 1998 through the spring of 2002, graduating with a degree in civil engineering and a record of academic achievement that earned her admission the following year to a graduate program at Stanford. The Excellence in Service Family Scholarship renewed itself each of her 4 undergraduate years, exactly as promised, never requiring so much as a reapplication beyond a simple annual transcript submission confirming her continued good standing. Hector never learned, throughout those 4 years, anything more than what the Foundation's director had told him on the phone in 1998. He continued working the night shift at Warner Brothers. He continued on the rare occasions when a late-night production meeting kept Eastwood on the lot, exchanging the same brief, friendly greetings he always had, neither man ever referencing the hallway conversation from September of 1998 again, not once, in over a decade of continuing to pass each other on the same sound stages. Hector Salgado retired from Warner Brothers in 2009 after 31 years of service, the great majority of it on the night shift. The studio held a modest retirement gathering for him in one of the smaller sound stages, attended by several department heads, a number of crew members who had worked alongside him over 3 decades, and, briefly, Clint Eastwood himself, who happened to be on the lot that week finishing post-production on a picture, and stopped by for 15 minutes to shake Hector's hand and tell him, in front of the assembled crowd, that the lot would not run the same without him. A statement that earned a round of genuine applause and that Hector, characteristically, accepted with quiet embarrassment rather than any visible pride. It was at this retirement gathering, in 2009, 11 years after the original hallway conversation, that the truth finally surfaced, and it surfaced almost by accident. Maria Salgado, by then 29 years old and working as a structural engineer in San Diego, had flown up for her father's retirement party. She was introduced to Eastwood briefly in the general round of handshakes and congratulations that accompanies any retirement gathering, and in the brief exchange of pleasantries, Eastwood, perhaps simply making conversation, perhaps genuinely curious after 11 years, asked her how her time at UCLA had gone, mentioning, almost in passing, that he understood she had studied civil engineering. Maria, surprised that he knew this detail at all, mentioned that, yes, she had studied engineering, and that she had been fortunate enough to attend on a scholarship that had covered the gap her family's financial aid package left uncovered, a scholarship she still did not fully understand the origins of after 11 years. Eastwood's expression, according to the department head standing nearest the exchange, who recounted the moment years later in an oral history interview about working conditions at Warner Brothers across several decades, did something subtle and almost imperceptible. A flicker of recognition quickly smoothed back into neutrality. The look of a man who has just realized a carefully built piece of architecture has, after 11 years, come within one sentence of revealing itself. He said only that it sounded like a well-deserved scholarship. He congratulated her on the engineering career. He moved on to the next person in the receiving line. The moment passed for everyone present except Maria, who found herself walking back to her car after the party, turning the brief exchange over in her mind, the specific detail that Eastwood had known she studied civil engineering, a detail that had never appeared in any of the Foundation's correspondence, and that she had certainly never mentioned to him before that afternoon. She mentioned the strange flicker of suspicion to her father on the drive home. Hector, who had spent 11 years not asking questions he suspected he might not want different answers to, was quiet for a long moment behind the wheel. Then he told her, for the first time, about the hallway conversation in September of 1998, the conversation he had never mentioned to her or to Rosa in all the intervening years. The conversation he had filed away privately as an unlikely coincidence rather than a connected cause. Because the alternative, that one of the most famous men in the world had quietly arranged his daughter's entire college education over a 5-minute hallway conversation and never once mentioned it again, had seemed, for 11 years, simply too large a thing to believe without proof he did not have, and had decided, somewhere along the way, not to go looking for. Neither Hector nor Maria ever confronted Eastwood directly. They discussed it as a family, the three of them together, in the weeks after the retirement party, and reached a quiet consensus that mirrored, in its own way, the exact discretion Eastwood himself had built the arrangement around. If he had wanted them to know with certainty, he would have told them. The not knowing, the not confirming, was itself part of the gift, a way of ensuring the family never felt obligated, never felt watched, never carried the particular weight that comes from knowing precisely whose generosity you are living inside of. Maria has said, in the one interview she gave years later for a piece on overlooked studio employees and their families, that she has never tried to verify the connection beyond what her father told her that afternoon in the car, and that she has come to believe the not knowing, oddly, is the more honest way to hold the gratitude, because it keeps the gift exactly the size it was always meant to be, an act between two people in a hallway, rather than a story that anyone else gets to own. Hector Salgado lives in Burbank still, retired, gardening, occasionally driving past the Warner Brothers lot, where he worked the night shift for 31 years. He has never spoken publicly about the scholarship beyond the single interview Maria gave on his behalf. He keeps, in a drawer in his bedroom, the original UCLA acceptance letter from September 1998, the one with the financial aid summary folded behind it that never quite covered enough. The letter he was reading on an overturned bucket during his lunch break the day everything changed without his understanding, for 11 years, exactly why. Some debts get paid in a hallway in under 5 minutes by a man who asks a few careful questions and then disappears into channels designed specifically so that no one will ever be entirely sure. That is the whole of it. That is what nobody knew until 2009, and even then knew only almost, only mostly, only in the particular and respectful way that some truths are better left one sentence short of confirmed. And, unfortunately, they do not make men like that anymore. If this story reached you, pass it on. Share it with someone who has worked quietly for decades and never once been thanked the way they deserved. Subscribe if you haven't yet. There are more stories like this one, and every single one of them deserves to be told.